Hi there, welcome to the Catalyst VFX pack. In this video I'm going to go over all the logic built into the pack and hopefully get it set up for you to be ready to put into your game. First I'm going to go over the interactables here. So there's 10 different weapons in the game. I've set up these little interactable tubes that have weapons in them that you can walk up to and swap out your weapon. So if we take a look at the blueprint here, you can see the initial setup for it. There's a few elements here in the viewport here. So we've got our static mesh, which is the compartment that is holding the weapon, a cylinder that's like a glass container for it, a Niagara system that's kind of giving it that effect of floating and sparkles inside, a few point lights, and the equip text and the name of the weapon up at the top here, and then the weapon itself. So if we look at the setup for it here, how this thing is working is it is taking this box component, which we can see in the viewport is kind of jetting out from the front, and it is detecting whether the first person character has moved into it, and if they have, it shows them our equip text, which is that little box with the text that tells you the button to equip with, and then if the player presses that button, it executes this code that takes the weapon that you've stored here, that information, and updates it for the first person character. This event here, the equip state, just drives the animations when you actually do interact with it and swipes the weapon away so that it looks like the container is empty. The one underneath is the rollover state. And what this one is doing is brightening up the capsule and showing your equip text so that when the player does actually move into that box capsule, they see a visual change that lets them know that it's now interactable with. This final event here reactivates a old weapon capsule that is now become available again when you've equipped something new. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So we walk up here, we see the rollover, we get our E to equip prompt, and it brightens the capsule up, and we press E, the weapon is emptied out, we can't equip, we can't press E, it doesn't do anything. Now if we go to another weapon capsule, press E, we can see in that previous one, it has become available again, you can see the weapon inside there. Looking back at the blueprint here, we have four variables that we've made instance editable. What that means is we can now drop multiple versions, which we have 10 of them, and we can customize each one by these different variables. So let's take a look at these variables. The first one is the weapon blueprint itself. So this one is BP gun shotgun. Um, this this is the information it sends to the character itself when you press E and will actually equip that specific blueprint. This weapon name is just the name that gets displayed above the weapon capsule here. So you can just type new stuff in and you can see that reflected up above. The third one here is the crosshair. This is the widget that is your crosshair that you'll see appears in the center of your screen once you've equipped that new weapon. And the last one is it an alien weapon or not? And as you'll see throughout the project, there's a lot of two different variations of something. It looks human or it looks alien. And if it is alien, there's a few different components that you'll see change over with that, and I'll talk about that later. So if we look in our blueprints folder in the Catalyst VFX folder, we can see a guns folder. In there, you'll see the 10 different weapons that you see displayed in the map and a additional BP gun. BP gun is our parent gun blueprint, and that has got some of the most basic logic that will have functions for that'll be used in every single instance of the different guns. So to start with, we on our begin play, we have a bunch of bindings that we are driving from the first person character. We have the trigger pull, trigger release, and the equipped weapon. With trigger pull, we've got some basic logic here that is just determining whether the weapon is on cooldown, the length of the cooldown, and then resetting it and not firing any logic off if it is still on cooldown. We also have this fire sequence event, which we'll just use within the child blueprints themselves. Trigger release, you'll see there's nothing here, but it is usable in the child widgets, and you'll see in some of those other widgets we do use that. And with the weapon equipped, we have just some visual logic to create a visual distinction when you do equip a new weapon and you see the weapon fade out and a new color of weapon appears. Okay, so if we take a look at our get projectile function, this is the main function for how the gun works. And basically what it does is it takes a line trace and fires it out from the center of your screen. Um, it is getting the viewport size, finding where that center is, and firing it out until it hits something, or if it goes a certain distance, then it ends. And what that does is make sure that the projectile will always hit exactly where your crosshair is pointing, no matter how close it is to your camera or how far away it is. It'll always be pointing at that exact crosshair center point. So there's a few things here that you can feed into it. One of them being the distance that you want to do that line trace and offsetting it. So I'll show you in some of the other gun blueprints, they'll be using those in different ways. But that's basically this logic here. And the other function in here is the get auto target. This is just for setting up a automatic shooting gun without the character's input. I mostly just use this for testing purposes, so I left it in here just in case someone would like to use that as well. Okay, with the BP gun covered, let's take a look at one of the child of the BP guns. So we've got BP gun assault rifle human, which is our default assault rifle weapon that the player character starts with. Let's take a look at that. So in here, right off on begin play, we have a variable being set, and that's variable is spread. And what spread is, if we go back to BP gun, spread is deciding the width of the cone around the crosshair to randomize that position of where that ray trace will. So it will give you a general circular based spread of your weapon. It's not too advanced, but it should get you something more natural looking than every bullet hitting the exact same spot every time. So going back to our BP assault rifle, um, we are getting that projectile target, which gives us a transform, which we can then feed into our projectile itself, and that will give it the information it needs to travel where you want it to go. Um, you also have a distance here that I've made just 10,000 units, just to make sure that it can go really far and figure out where that's going to land. Um, we're also firing some things off on the player character, one of them being the little kickback for the animation, and activating the crosshair itself so that animates and reacts to gunfire. And we're also activating our muzzle flash. So right here, over in the components here, we've got the muzzle flash, and you can insert any different type of Niagara system in there, and that will get triggered every time the gun fires. Um, so there's a bit of a unique mechanic with this assault rifle compared to the other weapons, which is you can press and hold it, and it will actually increase its fire rate the longer you hold it. And so that's what this logic here is doing, which is um, it is increasing this fire rate as it goes, and then it repeats the process as long as you're still holding the trigger. And if you let go of the trigger and the trigger release is set, then it's going to check is it still firing. If it's not still firing, then it's going to stop shooting out new projectiles. So that's the basic setup for the BP assault rifle for the human. Let's take a look at the grenade launcher for the human as well. Um, Very similar setup. As you can see with the BP gun setup, it has a lot of that defaults already built in, so there's not a lot of work per instance that you set it up. So we've got the spread set again on begin play, but we've also got a cooldown because um, we don't want the player to be able to just rapidly shoot these things. We want the player to have to wait and shoot at a certain rhythm. And so that cooldown is now set at zero point 0.8 of a second, and then that means you can only fire it that often. um, so we've got the firing sequence again. It is a very similar setup. We're getting the projectile target, sending that transform into a projectile, the fire anim for the player character, and the activation of the muzzle flash. So it's simpler because we don't have the press to hold to keep firing. Next, let's take a look at BP Gun Laser Human. And what's unique about this one is it is not using a projectile. So it's just going to be using that line trace to create a visual that represents a laser. Um, but it does have a pretty similar setup. So let's look at this. We've got spread 0. Because it is a laser, I wanted it to not have any spread at all, and it's just firing dead on target every time. But it does have a cooldown as well as the grenade launcher. Um, as you can see, pretty similar stuff with activating the crosshair, activating the muzzle flash. Um, what this thing also has though is a delay because it has a wind up to it. Um, when you let's take a look at that. So you see that's got that wind up effect to give it that build up before the laser actually appears, and we need to give it time after you've clicked to activate the rest of the effect. Um, so let's look at what's happening here, where we're using that same get projectile target, but instead of using this transform to feed into a projectile, we're using all the trace and impact points to define where our laser visual is gonna start and it's gonna end. So that's being used, and we've got checks for whether it's impact or not, and we're going to fire off different things based on whether it has actually hit a target or not. Um, Here's our laser here. We're setting the length of the beam right into the Niagara system. The beam end location is being set here, and then we're activating the particle system. And then we have this impact event. So what this is doing is it's spawning the particle system at the impact point. We're spawning a decal with this BP impact decal and initiating that decal. And so what you can see, the result is we see that effect happen on the location, and then we have the decal which appears and then slowly disappears over time. So one final thing with the BP guns is some of them have been set up for just auto firing. I set these up for video taking purposes and just testing purposes to see it from different angles. Um, I haven't done it for all of them, but you can continue to do that for all of them if you want. Um, but for some of them, you can see some of the logic in here. There is an is auto firing bool. Um, it is that then just hitting the fire sequence has a delay and then just keeps hitting it every time over and over again so that if you place the actor in the world, you'll just see it firing over and over again. Um, because the setup for get projectile target works is using the player character's perspective, you need a different function to get the target again, so that we're going to use this get auto target, and then that will spawn the projectile instead. But everything else is basically the same. So that's pretty much it for our BP guns. They're all just different variations of that same logic, but used in different and creative ways. And hopefully, when you get your hands on this, you can create new gun types that um, use this logic in different ways and can create really cool things with it. So I briefly mentioned with the human laser weapon, the impact decal. So what a lot of these weapons do is they leave a decal in the location that they hit something. There's a BP impact decal which is driving that logic. So let's take a look at that. So we've got all our logic here is basically just in this one event called initiate decal. What it's doing is it's got three things being fed into it. It's got a material that we're going to be using, the length of time, and the duration of the fade out. So the length is like it'll be staying on screen for like 10 seconds, and then fade length would be, and then it has like a 3-second fade out over time. And the rest of it is just based on um, where its rotation is and stuff like that will all be figured out by the logic itself. So let's take a look at how this is applied. We'll go back to our BP laser gun human, and we have our impact event here. And what we're doing is we're taking that information from the impact event of the location and the rotation, and we're feeding it into the transform of our spawning impact decal. And from there, we initiate the decal itself. So we have our material, and then we have our length of time, which is 2 seconds, and then it'll have 3 seconds of fading out from 100% opacity to 0. And that's a simple way to set up our decals and get them firing off whenever a bullet impact happens. Okay, so one of the first things you're going to see in the VFX pack are a bunch of different shield effects. There is some logic built into these so that they actually react to your gunfire. When you fire at them, it'll spawn a particle system on top of the regular impact particle system that's already firing off. We've got this like little blue ring that appears, or a little red ring if it's the alien one versus the human one. Um, we also have material parameters being driven so that the the whole mesh itself reacts to the gunfire as well. So you can see the whole shield is flashing, or on these ones, the bubble is actually deforming to your gunfire, and then this one, you're getting that grid pattern firing out. So let's take a look at that logic. So like with the guns, we have our parent blueprint, which is driving most logic for all these other child blueprints, and that is our BP shield. So let's open this up and look at it. In our viewport, we have just two things. We've got our mesh and we've got our point light. Um, the point light is just to add a little more atmospherics to it. You can get rid of that, but it just adds a little more depth to it when it actually seems to be casting light onto the ground and area around it. The mesh is the important part here because this defines where the shield is actually blocking and the effect itself. So we've got like over here you've got your static mesh that you can feed into it, and then the material itself. So looking at the logic here back in the event graph, it's pretty simple. We've only got the one event called impact event, and this is what's being used to drive all those visuals for each individual child widget or child blueprint here. The first thing that's happening is it's checking if you have actually inputted a impact particle, whether that's valid or not. Um, as you can see here over in the components, we've got our impact particle. So you can choose whether to have one there or not. You could just clear this if you want, and then it will ignore the spawning in a particle system. But if you do want it there, um, you you can insert whatever particle system you want, and that will automatically be set in the position and rotation of where that impact position point was. Um, After that spawning the particle system, we're getting the dynamic material from the mesh itself, and then we're driving a few different things. We're driving an impact location, and we're driving this parameter called impact, which is the general opacity of the effect itself happening. So if we look at shield wall human material, we've got the impact driving a few things. So we've got it driving. Okay, so looking at one of the child blueprints here, we'll take a look at BP Shield Dome Alien, and which this one is the big circular kind of bubbly looking one. Um, and we can see here in the viewport we've got our default impact particle here, which I fed in a Niagara system of the shield impact alien, so it's going to be like a red ping happening on it. We've got our static mesh, which is, instead of a plane, it's a sphere, and our material applied here. Change the point color light to red, and then we also have this sphere collision capsule, which will define our where the actual shield is covering and where the impact points will be. So down here, um, if you add this on view component hit, which I've already done here, um, here's how we're going to drive that event that we have in our BP shield. And all we need from it is this hit result structure, and we get a few things, just the location and then the impact normal, and then we feed that into the impact event, and then everything else is automatic. So what you need to make sure though is in your material, all the names are named the same as what they're named in the logic here. So you've got your impact location and impact itself, and we'll take a look at that material and see how that's being used. So impact location, what that is, what this logic is doing is it's creating a sphere mask. Imagine like a 3D sphere is appearing in that point where your bullet has then impacted that point. And what the logic in this particular material is doing is it's deforming the vertices in that circular area and pushing it inwards. So then that gives you that effect like it's like the bullets are bouncing off of it and creating deformations into it. So that's the impact location. That drives the actual location of where that effect will appear. And then impact itself is the opacity of it. So what that does is it goes from 1 and then goes back down to 0 every time it happens so that the effect appears and then disappears over time. So it's pretty simple. As long as your naming conventions are the same, you could just repeat this process over and over again. And we'll dive in here into another child widget. So we've got alien wall, and this time it just uses the mesh itself. And click on component hit, and we've got it here, getting that break result, and then feeding it back into the impact event. And each one of those are as simple as that, and hopefully you'll be able to create new cool shielding with that same logic. Okay, so we've gone over all the blueprints throughout the VFX pack. Um, so let's take a look at some other things that we need to go over to make sure that these VFX work in your project. One of them being this hologram material and effect here, and a lot of its logic is similar to the shielding done over here as well, and a little bit of pre-work needs to be done to make sure that it looks as good as it does right here. Um, what this effect is using something called custom depth pass, and what that does is it makes sure that you can have a translucent material that it's overlapping itself not be seen through itself. And I'll show you what that means here. So if we go on the mesh itself and look at our rendered custom depth pass, you're going to have to make sure that this is turned on for whatever mesh that you apply to this material to. And I'll show you the result of what it looks like when you turn it off. So this is what's happening when you turn it off, and this is what the material is probably going to look like when you put it onto apply it to a mesh yourself right away. What it's doing is you're seeing all the insides of it. So you're seeing those little bone joints, you're seeing the arm behind the torso here and stuff like this. But we don't want that. We want it to be look like a full character without seeing the insides of it, but still have it transparent and see-through. And what that requires us to do is make sure that this custom depth pass is checked on the mesh, and then you see the effect being applied properly. And then you can see it over here, and you can see how it's properly omitting all the areas behind it, but it's still invisible, and you can still see the level behind it there. So now that you've checked it on the render custom depth pass, we want to also make sure that the project itself can recognize that. So if you go to edit and then project settings and then type in custom depth at the top here, you have your custom depth stencil pass, and you want to make sure that it is enabled, and you could also have it enable with stencil, and we can go over the stencil stuff later. Okay, so the final thing to go over here is these two scanner post-process effects that we've got here. We've got the alien one, and we've got the human one here. And as you can see, it is actually revealing these character meshes that are behind objects. So it's actually giving you like a 3D type vision. And how that is done is it's using that custom stencil pass that we just mentioned there. So we've got in the process volume that I'm sitting in right now, I've added this MPP um, human scan, which is the post process that is actually creating this effect. Um, and in there, we've got some logic that is creating a custom stencil and isolating those characters themselves and making sure that they are visible no matter like where they are, if they're behind objects or if they're hiding beneath scenery and stuff like that. You'll see them no matter where they are. So we've got our logic in the material here for the custom stencil, and then you need to on the characters themselves. You just need to look up stencil and make sure that this stencil value is the same number as in your material there. So this one's 1 and 1, and now that now that that's set, you'll see that they all get revealed because of that. And that's pretty much it. So that's everything involved in the pack. And if you have any other questions about anything, you can reach out to me at the email address I'm going to probably put below this video. And hopefully you enjoy everything. Thank you.